so that it never goes unappreciated, can we express to our musicians, all of them, each and every one of them, how much we appreciate the energy and artistry and the spirit of what they bring to us? So this Sunday, it's the fourth Sunday of Advent. It's not quite Christmas, though this year I confess as your pastor that I have been lax in holding the wall on Christmas, not till Christmas Eve, and not letting there be Christmas creep into Advent. For this, my colleagues have called me out on the carpet and said, "You know better." But the truth is, it's hard to wait 4 full weeks till Christmas, and I think we all need a little Christmas, even a little Christmas early. So please forgive me in this liturgical weakness. But we are looking today at Matthew's Christmas story, even though we're saving Luke for Christmas Eve. And that's because Luke is the really good one. It's got shepherds, it's got angels, it's got a star. You can't compete, right? Poor Matthew has this story in here, and we're going to look at it. And I invite you to be in that place of both yet and not yet, this close to Christmas, waiting with anticipation, and yet knowing it's okay if we open a few presents early because of our curiosity. And I also want to acknowledge on this Sunday that this season can be one that is complicated for people who struggle with how to be spiritual and maintain their intellectual integrity. It's a time of year when we talk about miracles, about young women giving birth, and in some traditions they emphasize a virgin giving birth. We don't do that so much in the Protestant church, but it's still part of it. And it's a stretch for some who have very good, legitimate, rational reasons to resist the Christmas story. I want to invite you to, first of all, I affirm your absolute desire to maintain your integrity about faith. The United Church of Christ is a church that recognizes that people have ambivalence around religion. And at the same time, I want to invite every one of us, to be open in some way to a revelation or an opening or some mystery that brings us comfort and consolation. Ultimately, we come together on Sundays and tell the stories of the Gospels so that they'll inspire us and also comfort and console us. This week at our Death Cafe, which we hold monthly on the third Thursdays of each month, we had a very large turnout, and we focused a lot on Christmas because people were talking about people that they missed this time around or this time of year, Christmas memories, struggling very much to be in the present and to appreciate who's in our life right now, this year, and yet acknowledging that it can be painful to be aware of who's here, who's not here, who we miss, customs we might miss. And what happened in the course of our hour and a half together was that people at the end used words like, "I feel better, I feel comforted," because we came together and shared a real story about our struggles with this time of year, with our grief. And I do think that that's one reason why we're here today, Tuesday night, to be real with each other, to acknowledge our losses, our griefs, as well as to be open to some comforting touch that helps us feel that in some way nothing is impossible and that hope can still be renewed. The columnist, just a regular columnist for the New York Times named David Brooks, and he had a column this week in which he describes his own ambivalent journey of faith. The shock of faith. It's nothing like I thought it would be. I can make copies of it afterwards if you're interested in reading it and don't have a subscription to the Times. But I did feel like in seminary when they told us to preach with the New York Times in one hand and the Bible in the other, so that it would be relevant to people. But this is how he describes his own surprising journey from being an agnostic. If that, there's nothing wrong, I want to say up front. You can be atheist and proud here. You can be agnostic and proud here. You can be orthodox and proud here. This is a place where everyone is welcome, no kidding. But I was moved by his essay about his movement of faith. He talked about how it started to stir for him in 2013. And this is what he said. We religious people talk about virtue so much, you'd think we behaved better than non-religious people. But that's not been my experience. Over the past decade, especially in the American church, I've seen religious people behaving more viciously, more dishonestly, and in some ways being more tolerant of sexual abuse. I sometimes joke that entering the church in 2013 was like investing in the stock market in 1929. My timing could have been better. And then he just goes on to describe various things that happened to him as his life unfolded, as he experienced change that caused him to be open in new ways. And he then describes in the essay this very moving account of discovering God on the subway or having a spiritual awakening in the subway. Where is it? He says, in 2013, I experienced an acceleration of these moments. These times were not mere spooky experiences, but illuminations, events that tell us about the meaning of life and change the way we see the world. Change the way we see the world. One morning in April, I was in a crowded subway car underneath 33rd Street and 8th Avenue, truly one of the ugliest spots on this good green earth. I looked around the car and I had this shimmering awareness that all the people in it had souls. Each of them had some piece of themselves that had no size, color, weight, or shape, but that gave them infinite value. The souls around me that day seemed not inert, but yearning, some soaring, some suffering or sleeping. Some were downtrodden and crying out. These thoughts helped me think more deeply about my job. I had approached journalism with the vague sense that the people we cover have a basic dignity by virtue of being human. But seeing them as creatures with souls, as animals with a spark of the divine, helped me see people in all their majesty. Seeing them simultaneously as fallen and broken creatures both prepared me for their depravities and made me feel more tender toward our eternal human tendency to screw things up. I hope I see each person as greater height and depth. So he describes throughout this essay, and I commend it to you, the journey of being an unlikely person and yet finding himself, in this case, moved to a deeper awareness of the beauty of humanity and the beauty of all of creation, created and artificial. Yearning to find his place in the Christmas story, as he describes in the essay later on. And I do think that we all have a place in this Christmas story if we are open to it. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, whose City Lights bookstore is one of my favorite places on the planet, I think, in San Francisco, is a poet, a beatnik poet. He lived to be over 100 and died recently. But he writes this poem about Christ coming down to earth. And he describes a number of really kind of gritty circumstances in which he believed as a poet or an imagining person that Christ could be present, or that God could be present, however we want to say it, in all of our human circumstances. And then also the poet Madeleine L'Engle, who I had the great pleasure to meet when I was a freshman at Columbia, because she was the librarian at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And she said, every year I look to see which Columbia student will wander over and wash up on my doorstep to gush about how the book A Wrinkle in Time changed their lives. I was one of those 18-year-olds who found my way to her doorstep. And so she has this poem about the risk of giving birth and how it's never a good time, never an opportune time, and yet love is worth the risk. I think that these poets and columnists and others speak to us, whether we're Orthodox believers or legitimate skeptics, about our yearning to have deeper meaning and our yearning to have hope in our lives. And Matthew's gospel stands alongside these kinds of poems and stories because Steve did, I think, really amazing duty as a reader this morning. I spared him reading the beginning verses of the Gospel of Matthew. It's a whole page, and you probably heard it referred to as the begats. It's a whole page of genealogy, 3 sets of 14 generations in which Jesus' lineage is described for the people of who will be hearing the story in Matthew's community. And what's remarkable about it, you could read the whole chapter and think, what the heck, what is this about? But it's about locating us in the story of what we call salvation history, the story of God's activity among human life. And in those many generations that are described there painstakingly, there are a few remarkable names put there to remind us that we all have a place. Genealogies sometimes are traced through fathers, sometimes through mothers. In Matthew's gospel, uniquely, both mothers and fathers are mentioned. And there are 4 women who are called out in the genealogy. Tamar, who had been who had experienced violence, sexual violence, actually. Rahab, who was described in the Old Testament terms as a harlot. Today we would say a sex worker, a person who made her living in a way that many people sought out, but many more people stigmatized. Also Ruth, who was part of an immigrant family. And Ruth is named Ruth of Ruth and Naomi fame. And then at the very end, Mary is mentioned, the husband of Joseph, and yet to include her in the genealogy is a clue for us to find ourselves in this story. Historians, religious writers with their patriarchal bias usually leave all of that out, leave out over half of humanity, women, even though this story can't take place without Mary's consent, which is a theme stressed more in Luke's gospel, but still here she is, front and center, listed as an essential character. And the part that Steve picked up with for us begins with the birth of Jesus, but really, this is why we're able to use it on the 4th Sunday of Advent. It talks about the events leading up to it. The birth is there, but there's a lot of backstory. And here's what I want to say about this gospel for us on this 4th Sunday of Advent. In the not quite yet time, Mary and Joseph have advice for us, or invitations for us, particularly about our willingness to take a risk, to disrupt routine, to be willing to confront social convention if necessary, in order to claim ourselves in this story. Because if the story has any meaning, it has this meaning. God sees us as we are, loves us unconditionally, and wants to be part of our lives. One friend of mine said this week, who's grieving the loss of his partner of 50 years, for the first Christmas that they've been apart in 50 years, said, well, God has certainly met me more than halfway this year. And that phrase struck me, that God is willing to meet us all the way, certainly more than halfway, even when we might not entirely be open to it. Joseph and Mary have an experience of God, and they do so because of 3 things. 1, they're shameless. And I use that word intentionally. The story talks about the unseemly origins of Mary and Joseph according to the religious customs of that day. And it could well be that some of these customs prevail even in the presence. That is shame about sexuality, about who's married, who's not. I grew up in an adopted family where people would use words like illegitimate, things like that. These were the people who loved us, my sister and I, because there was a custom in the 1950s of talking about, a girl being in trouble, right? Or that this was a source of great shame. And in a Catholic family, she would be sent away. And I think some of the shame around those things that were characteristic of society in that time still linger in our own time, in our own families, even in ourselves. Let me say this very clearly. Mary and Joseph were not married. And Joseph is described as decent because he could have turned her over to religious authorities and she would have been punished. Or he could divorce her quietly. And they use the word divorce because they were engaged but not married. I mean, I can't believe the church concerns itself with things like this, but I'm reminded that when I was in seminary, I was taught how to be attentive to whether a couple coming to me for wedding preparation actually lived together before marriage. And I was to counsel them about the ill advisement of this. And I say, and we really were taught like what to listen for and to see if they're being evasive. I'm so embarrassed that that's part of our Christian tradition. I want to say this very clearly. It's okay to live together before marriage. It's okay for people to explore their sexual lives appropriately with consent. But this is not a church that encourages shame. This is a church that liberates us from any shame that we might have about anything, because shame doesn't help us. It never helps us. And sometimes it's enforced socially, and sometimes we enforce it ourselves because of how we've been trained or raised or educated or miseducated. Mary and Joseph are not married, and the shame potential in this story is strong. But God, through an angel, counsels Joseph, or through a dream, counsels Joseph to disregard the shame. Be shameless, and don't worry what people think about you. There would be no Christmas miracle if shame had prevented it. But Mary and Joseph say to us, be shameless in your openness to divine revelation and to human experience. And then the next thing that they say to us is to take risks. Mary and Joseph, in this account and in the other account, do take a risk. There could have been easier paths for how their story could unfold. But they stand to us as testimony in our sacred book that if you want to experience life and spirit and hope, the first thing you might have to abandon is habit, routine, convention, and really be open, taking a risk, because love is worth the risk. And the last thing that this story invites us to do is to pay attention to our dreams. Joseph is visited in a dream. And because of his dream, he and Mary set forth and do something that changes the world because of love. What are dreams? I've been working with a sleep clinic to have better sleep, right? So one of the things I learned about was REM sleep. I realize I'm talking to a congregation of highly scientifically educated people, but I just want to remind us that dreams come to us partly because we take the time for rest and we have the kind of sleep where dreaming can happen. And also a dream, it's not a metaphor exactly, but I think that we can dream while we're wide awake. It's our capacity to imagine a different ending or a different trajectory. We sometimes call that a dream, but that is a way that I believe God speaks to us in rest through dreams, or waking through consciousness, through hoping, through longing, to being open to the possibility that the way things look like they're going doesn't have to be the way they are going, and that we are agents in our own lives, and we can help one another too when they are making changes. So that's Mary and Joseph's little early Christmas card to us. Be shameless, take risks, and dream, 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 so that the very craziest of reconceptions, to use Ferlinghetti's words, can happen not only as we tell the story of Jesus and Mary and Joseph 2,000 years ago or more, but in our own lives as well. Christmas isn't here yet, so be open to something happening that maybe you never thought was possible. Amen.